So I am very, very proud to announce, as I said in my speech, the reason why so many of us have put our faith in Jeremy Corbyn is because he is just like one of us that have been campaigning all these years. I'm speaking for the People's Assembly Against Austerity, and Jeremy Corbyn was one of the founding members of the People's Assembly Against Austerity all those years ago. And with great pleasure, I would like to announce Philippa Thompson, who is our next MP for Preseli Pembrokeshire. Jeremy Corbyn, who is our next Prime Minister. Thank you.
Good evening, Haverfordwest! I'm delighted to be here alongside our leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy, the first time I met you was when you spoke to a group of us from the Foreign Office about working in Parliament. And you spoke passionately about the crisis in housing in your constituency.
We love you, Jeremy! We love you, Jeremy!
Your first question to the Prime Minister when you became our Leader of the Opposition was about housing. So I hope I will have the good fortune to have the opportunity later this week to be elected to represent the constituents of Preseli, Pembrokeshire with just as much passion and just as much care as Jeremy has represented his constituents and would now represent all of us in this country. Pembrokeshire is a fantastic place to live and a fantastic place to visit. However, many of our young in particular leave to find work. I would like to see people have more opportunities here in Pembrokeshire so that they have more choice. And I hope, therefore, to see you here, Jeremy, not only at election time, but to welcome you back as our Prime Minister. Labour's ambitious plans a reality for everyone in our country, and with change coming right along the M4 and carrying on to this far western edge of Wales. I may say on behalf of all of us here, Croeso I Siabendro, welcome to Pembrokeshire, Jeremy Corbyn.
Good evening, Haverfordwest. Good evening, Preseli, Pembrokeshire. You're going to win it for Labour on Thursday. Is Philip going to be your next MP? Yes, we're going to win it. And yes, we're going to win it for everybody. Yes, we're going to win it for everybody. We're going to win it for everybody in this election, because this election is about justice for people all across Britain. Last night you saw in the debate what was going on. You saw that the Prime Minister represents a party that's created and is funded by billionaires. You saw in the debate that he has the only solution to his problems is a trade deal with the United States that would put our health service at risk of American companies taking it over. You can see what they're doing in this election campaign. A party funded by billionaires for the inequality of this country. Well, is it right that in the 5th richest country in the world, there are 4 million children living in poverty? No! That over Christmas, more than 100,000 children will not know the security of a safe home in which to live. Thousands of people will be rough sleeping over Christmas in parks and tents, stations and bus stations, and all the other places they just try and find somewhere to survive. And all the while, the gap between the richest and the poorest has got wider and wider and wider. In 2010, the Tories and the Liberal Democrats got together, formed a coalition government, and decided that make the political choice, and it was a political choice, of austerity. They used it to cut local government spending in England, to cut the budget for the government of Wales. They used it to freeze benefits, to freeze public sector wages, to introduce universal credit, and to create, quite deliberately, poverty throughout the lives of many people. Most working class families have a spending power of between 20 and 25% less than it was 10 years ago. Small wonder that all over the country, Wales, England, Scotland, high streets are struggling to survive, shops struggling to survive because of that loss of spending power. And so we cannot go on like this as a country. We cannot go on with this degree of inequality and the levels of stress it creates in society. The growth of mental health stress and the mental health crisis, the growth of debt, personal debt, household debt, and student debt all over the UK. Surely to goodness, we need to do things differently. And when the United Nations, yes, the United Nations, sends a special rapporteur to Britain to examine poverty, you ask yourself a question, hang on a minute, we're supposed to be a rich country. We're supposed to have a welfare state. We're supposed to be a country that reaches out to everyone. And that report says that the social contract of the 1940s that agreed the principles of a welfare state, that nobody should fall into destitution, has been cast aside and replaced, in their words, by a cold and uncaring ethos. That is what austerity has done. And the rapporteur pointed out that the Welsh Labour government had done its best to mitigate against the effects of austerity, and I pay tribute to them for that. But surely to goodness, we need to do things very, very differently in this country. And so, our Labour government will end universal credit, will end the immorality of the two-child policy, the disgraceful rape clause that is included in it, and end that disgraceful wait to get onto benefits that means many people lose their homes and become homeless and sometimes rough sleeping as a result of that. These are not accidents of history. These are not mistakes that were made by people that should have known better. They were deliberate intention by central government to create a hostile atmosphere against the poor and the most needy in exactly the same way they created that racist hostile atmosphere against the Caribbean community and West African community, the Windrush generation that came here. And so I want something very different for our society in the future. I want something where we're a more inclusive society, a more hopeful society, where children can grow up in security rather than fear. That has to be the right way forward. And our government will also deal with the greatest issue facing the whole planet, the climate crisis that is there. It's happening. It's upon us at the present time. And we'll do that. We'll do that because we'll be hosting the Climate Change Conference next year in Britain, the UN Climate Change Conference, and we will go further and faster than what happened in Paris in 2015. I was there when the Paris Climate Change Accord was eventually agreed. And yes, it was a step forward because at least all countries signed up for it. Donald Trump wants to walk away from it. Boris Johnson probably doesn't understand it, and certainly doesn't seem to care about it. And at the current rate of progress, Britain might reach net zero by 2099. 70 years too late. By that time, the climate crisis will have got worse and worse all across the world. If we want to set an example, we've got to do it ourselves first. Therefore, our green, clean agenda in our manifesto, the plan for nature that we set out last week as well, is not about threatening people, it's about investing and using technology to preserve our environment and to invest in green technology jobs. Hence our support for the Swansea Bay Lagoon project and for electrification projects of railways across Wales. And today we announced that we will put money into turning our whole bus service across the whole country within 10 years into electric buses as a way of reducing pollution. And also in England and through devolved assemblies in Scotland and Wales, making sure that there is an effective public transport system. Because at the moment, people who live in remote areas, if they don't have a car, can't travel, can't move anywhere. It is about investment in public transport. And it's also supporting farmers, small farmers, doing their best to survive in a very difficult environment, and supporting them to also be the custodians and guardians of our natural world and our natural environment. Because we need to improve, not damage, the biodiversity on which we all need to survive. And so this green industrial revolution will create jobs in the big projects like Swansea Bay. It will create jobs in the wind farms that will be created all around the UK, and Wales has plenty of wind, as well as rain, and hills, and beauty, and music. So you've got it all, really. And those jobs will be the jobs for the future for our young people, because the society we're creating wants to be one that absolutely does create that sense of hope and opportunity for young people. And I'll be proud to lead a Labour government that does it. But next 5 days, we're going to get an awful lot thrown at us. We're going to get an awful lot thrown at us, and nothing greater than the issue of the future relationship with other countries. We have to trade with Europe, whether we're in or out of the European Union. We have to ensure our working conditions are at least as good, and we're not going to become an offshore tax haven, a bargain basement economy, where the rich thrive and the poor suffer. Because that is exactly what the agenda of the Tory party is. And so when we asked under the Freedom of Information Act for the government to release the documents of their secret trade talks with the USA, which they're now claiming never existed, having released documents to say they did exist. It's interesting. I think Alice in Wonderland would be an appropriate book to give the Prime Minister for Christmas. He may well have plenty of time to read over Christmas.
Go on, boy.
So we asked for those documents to be released, and they were. I got them. And it had a list of all the meetings that had taken place between British officials and United States officials to work out a future trade policy. All there. The only problem was every single line was gone through with a black marker to obliterate it. So there was absolutely nothing to read except the existence of the meetings. Then the United States produced a document which indicated that the meetings had taken place and that they had discussed how American companies in a trade deal wanted access to British public services markets. How they wanted access to the healthcare market in Britain. I mean, I just gently say to them, the healthcare market was ended in 1948 by N.R.M. Bevan when he set up the National Health Service. And then a very substantial set of documents were handed over, and I made them public a week ago, and they go through chapter and verse that American pharmaceutical companies will get longer patent time to sell medicines at greater cost outside the USA in Britain, and that Donald Trump himself has said that people pay too little for their medicines around the world. And remember when we took up the case of Acambi, very important medicine that's needed for people with very special conditions. After our campaign, eventually the NHS agreed to buy it. And I don't know what the price they're paying for it is, but I do know that it's time for us to challenge the costs we're paying for those medicines. And I want our National Health Service to be providing generic medicines, but also having its own manufacturing facility for those generic medicines, so we're not fleeced by big pharma. But I tell you this, they talk about access to a health market, no way. They talk about investor state
you come straight in front of me while I was recording.
American companies protection against a government that might well decide to increase the minimum wage, for example, or to regulate work, or to give full rights at work from day one. Does it sound familiar to you, what's in our manifesto? That is not acceptable to me. And so I just simply say this, to those that think our NHS is expendable, so far as I'm concerned, so far as my party's concerned, so far as we're concerned, the NHS is not for sale.
Come on!
Because the NHS is ours and precious and ours for the future. So we go into the last 5 days of this election campaign utterly determined to get our message across. Now, I'm sure there's going to be lots of abuse thrown at us over the last 5 days of the campaign, as if there hasn't been enough thrown already. Well, there's two ways of doing politics. Either you can get involved in a sort of trench warfare of personal abuse. You can get in the gutter and in the muck and in the mud and just throw abuse at each other. At the end of the day, that doesn't actually achieve very much. In fact, it turns people off. So my message to those that want to throw abuse around is quite simply this. You go low, that's fine. You get into the gutter, that's absolutely fine. We'll not be joining you there, because we'll go higher with something more important, which is the future of the lives of people all over this country. And that future is about an economy that works for all. It is about having rights at work from day one, full rights at work from day one. It is about a living wage of £10 an hour for all workers, including young workers, to eliminate the levels of poverty that are there all across Britain. And it is about investment in education and opportunities for the future. And John McDonnell has worked very hard on making sure, yes, he's a wonderful comrade, worked very hard on both our manifesto, but also the costings of it. We've produced a grey book in which every single line of our manifesto is fully funded and costed. Boris Johnson has produced a manifesto that's vague beyond belief, that doesn't offer anything except he promises that he will do things maybe differently, maybe not, maybe this, maybe that. I tell you this, a person that gets up the day after he's been appointed as Prime Minister announces there's going to be 40 new hospitals, sort of grandly somewhere, somehow. And then a week later the 40 becomes 20. A week after that it becomes 6. A week after that it becomes the seed funding for the consideration of the possibility of building 6 hospitals.
Shocking.
And where was the media attack on him for that? Where was the criticism of him for that? I tell you this, we need an analysis of what this government is doing to us, doing to all of us, and the poverty that's being created. We are the most divided country in Europe. We're getting more divided, poverty is getting worse, and the great gap is getting greater. But those in middle age, maybe relatively well off and thought they were moving into greater comfort in their lives, are finding that it's not there. They're finding they're having to borrow money in order to fund their families, in order just to survive. The levels of personal debt all across Britain have got worse and worse. And whilst the Welsh Government has done everything it can on social care and on education, the reality is it's had £1 billion taken off it by the Tory government in Westminster. So I say this, a Labour government elected next week will increase taxation, yes, for the top 5%. Yes, it will raise corporation tax to the level below the level it was in 2010 in order to fund the programme that we're putting forward. Every last bit of our programme is fully funded, and when achieved, it will bring our public services somewhere around the level of France or Germany. That is how far we've been taken by right-wing neoliberal economics over the past 40 years. The idea that the aspiration of a welfare state, of a fully functioning national health service, of funding for the arts, for music, funding for education, funding for all these things is a thing of the past. And so, when the choice comes on Thursday, please do absolutely everything you can. Remember the political choice made by David Cameron and his cohorts in 2010 was when they could have invested for the future. They could have recognised that you had to invest in order to bring about justice and equality. Instead, what they did was cut, cut, cut. And when you see high streets with very little happening in them, when you see places and communities damaged, when you see young people underachieving because they're not properly supported, all of that goes back to austerity. We can afford lots of things in this country. We cannot afford the levels of inequality that we've got. And I want to lead a Labour government that takes us in a different direction. Takes us in a different direction where we do not walk by on the other side to those that are less fortunate than any of us, those that are really suffering. And on the world stage, a government that would be a voice for peace, for justice and democracy and environmental sustainability around the world. That won't treat the refugee crisis as a bunch of enemies, but instead treat them as human beings that have suffered because of the wars that have happened around the world. And so, the choice is ours. Many people don't make up their minds how to vote until the last few days of the election. I think we need to put out there, very simply, what our manifesto says. Invest for the future. Create a society and a country fit for the next generation, or continue down this road of insufficient money on housing, insufficient money on education, insufficient money on healthcare, driving people into the private healthcare sector if they can afford it, or losing out altogether if they can't afford it. Or adopt the same principles that the wonderful post-war Labour government did, which it said was, out of the ashes of the Second World War, we will build a welfare state. Well, out of the destruction of our welfare state, or the attempted destruction of it, by austerity and the political choice that's been made, let's build that country, that society, and that government that will work for all Now go out there and remember that the incoming Labour government will also have a lot of other things on its plate. On its plate will be dealing with the housing crisis as quickly as we possibly can, but also some of the grotesque injustices of the past. That is the way in which the Miners' Pension Fund has been treated by the government, but also the way in which the WASPI women have been so grievously treated. So we will make sure that the WASPI women get justice by paying them properly. And that means we will do it because it's a moral debt. When I was challenged on this in the media, I said, well, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Some of them don't deserve it. So hang on a minute. We live in a society where you pay tax and national insurance as part of that contract that you get a pension when you reach retirement age. So we will not raise the retirement age beyond 66. We'll keep it there, and we'll pay the WASPI women what they're owed. Will have been stolen from them. And you'll have a government that is serious about properly funding public services to create that sense of security and building that society fit for the next generation. Chasing down the inequalities, the injustice, chasing down discrimination, the gender pay gap and all that goes with it. And those on the far right that want to divide us, those on the far right that always look for a scapegoat, no place for them whatsoever. Our unity will defeat them. Because you know what? When the far right start attacking one particular minority for this, for that, the other, they then move on to somebody else and move on and on. All they've created is fear, hatred, nastiness and violence against minority communities. And they haven't built a school, they haven't built a hospital, they haven't trained a teacher. Our government will be going in exactly the opposite direction. The unity of all people, the unity of communities, environmental sustainability and social justice across the country. And where our public services have been taken from us, mail, rail, water, they'll be brought back into public ownership. I'm proud of our manifesto, proud of what our movement has achieved, and proud today that so many tens of thousands of people have been out all over the country with that message. Are we to continue with fear, injustice and inequality, or is it going to be the message of hope and opportunity for everybody? To get that government, we need to win here in Preseli, Pembrokeshire. We need to get Philippa elected. We need to make those Labour gains across Wales and England and Scotland and win a Labour government that will work for the good of the entire country. Thank you very much. Good job. Christina Reed.